By 1940, Nazi Germany seemed invincible. German forces had swept across Europe with lightning speed, conquering Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in stunning displays of military might. The swastika flew from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. Yet, just 5 years later, Hitler would be dead in his bunker, Berlin in ruins, and Germany utterly defeated. This dramatic reversal of fortune stemmed from critical mistakes, fatal miscalculations, and systemic weaknesses that doomed the Third Reich from the very moment of its greatest triumphs. So how, and more importantly, why did Hitler lose? Hitler's first catastrophic mistake emerged from Germany's early victories, which bred dangerous overconfidence. Critical errors appeared almost immediately. The first major blunder came at Dunkirk in May 1940, with the British Expeditionary Force trapped on the French coast and facing annihilation. Hitler mysteriously ordered his panzers to halt just as they were about to deliver the killing blow. This inexplicable hesitation allowed over 300,000 Allied troops to escape across the English Channel in what became known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. The decision remains one of history's great mysteries. Some historians suggest Hitler hoped to negotiate peace with Britain, while others point to concerns about panzer losses in marshy terrain. Whatever the reason, by sparing Britain's army, Hitler ensured that Britain would fight on, setting the stage for the two-front war that would eventually destroy Germany. Many evacuees later fought in North Africa and Europe, but the D-Day assault was led by formations raised and trained later. Had they been captured or killed at Dunkirk, Britain's ability to continue the war would have been severely compromised, potentially forcing Churchill's government to seek peace terms. Compounding this error, Hitler then shifted his focus to the Battle of Britain. Convinced by Hermann Göring's boastful promises, he attempted to bomb Britain into submission rather than concentrating on more pressing strategic objectives. The Luftwaffe committed around 2,500 to 2,600 aircraft in total, while the RAF typically had 600 to 800 serviceable fighters during the peak weeks. Yet radar and command and control offset Germany's numerical edge. Initially targeting RAF airfields and radar stations, the Germans were on the verge of crippling British air defenses when Hitler made another fatal error. After a few German bombs accidentally hit London, Churchill ordered retaliatory raids on Berlin. Hitler, enraged by attacks on the Reich capital, redirected the Luftwaffe from military targets to terror bombing of London and other cities. This shift in targeting allowed the RAF crucial time to rebuild and regroup. British fighter production, operating from undamaged factories, actually exceeded German output during the battle. The prolonged Blitz campaign that followed wasted precious German aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots, while leaving Britain intact as a resilient base for future Allied counterattacks. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was indefinitely postponed, ensuring Germany could never secure its western flank. However, these early mistakes paled in comparison to Hitler's most catastrophic decision: the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa represented strategic overreach on an almost incomprehensible scale, committing Germany to fighting on two fronts, precisely the scenario that had destroyed the German Empire in World War I. Driven by his ideological obsession with conquering living space in the East and destroying what he viewed as racially inferior Bolshevism, Hitler launched a war of annihilation against the world's largest country. The scale was staggering. 3.8 million German and Axis troops crossed the Soviet border along an 1,800-mile front, supported by 33,500 tanks and 27,700 aircraft. Initially, the Wehrmacht thrust deep into Soviet territory with devastating effect. Within 3 weeks, German forces had advanced 450 miles, captured 400,000 prisoners, and destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many caught on the ground. Hitler confidently predicted the Soviet state would collapse like a house of cards within 8 to 10 weeks. Instead, the invasion awakened a sleeping giant with virtually unlimited manpower reserves. The Soviet Union could field over 300 divisions, more than the entire German army. The sheer vastness of the USSR, spanning 11 time zones, meant that even spectacular tactical victories barely dented Soviet strategic reserves. As German forces advanced, Their supply lines stretched impossibly thin while Soviet factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains continued producing weapons. Nazi brutality in occupied territories transformed what might have been viewed as liberation from Stalin's oppression into a desperate fight for survival. The Wehrmacht's criminal orders, including the Commissar Order directing the execution of captured political officers and the starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, ensured that surrender was not an option for Soviet forces. Entire Ukrainian and Baltic populations that initially welcomed German forces as liberators soon experienced the reality of Nazi racial policies, mass executions, deportations for slave labor, and systematic starvation. This brutality stiffened resistance and fueled an increasingly effective partisan movement that would eventually tie down hundreds of thousands of German troops in rear area security operations. The German advance began to falter by autumn 1941, bogged down by fierce resistance, extended supply lines, and the approaching Russian winter. Hitler had catastrophically failed to prepare for a winter campaign, providing no winter uniforms, anti-freeze, or cold weather equipment because he never expected the fighting to last beyond autumn. When the brutal Russian winter arrived, German forces faced temperatures often below -30 degrees Celsius or -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze, vehicles wouldn't start, and soldiers suffered massive casualties from frostbite. Meanwhile, the Red Army, equipped for winter warfare and reinforced by fresh Siberian divisions released from guarding against Japan, launched a devastating counteroffensive under General Zhukov. This failure to capture Moscow marked Nazi Germany's first major setback and, as military historians note, ended all hopes of a short war in Russia. The dream of a quick victory in the East had become a nightmare of attrition that would consume the Wehrmacht's strength. Rather than learning from these setbacks, Hitler compounded his strategic woes with even more reckless decisions. In December 1941, just days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, he declared war on the United States, despite having no obligation to do so under the Axis alliance and gaining no military assistance from Japan in return. This massive miscalculation virtually guaranteed Germany's defeat by pitting the Reich against the world's largest industrial power. American factories, protected by two oceans, would soon be producing weapons and equipment on a scale that dwarfed German capabilities. The United States alone would eventually field 16 million troops, while manufacturing enough equipment to supply not only American forces, but also Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The declaration of war on America also brought the U.S. Navy into the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats had been Germany's most effective weapon against British supply lines. American naval escorts, radar-equipped aircraft, and mass-produced destroyer escorts would soon turn the tide decisively against German submarines. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front in 1942, Hitler's obsession with symbolic victories led to the disaster at Stalingrad. Rather than concentrating forces for a decisive blow against either Moscow or the Caucasus oil fields, Hitler characteristically chose to pursue multiple objectives simultaneously, dividing his forces to capture both the city of Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler fatally overextended Army Group South. The decision to fight for Stalingrad itself, rather than simply cutting off the Volga River traffic the city controlled, transformed a strategic objective into a prestige battle that consumed irreplaceable German resources. The siege of Stalingrad devolved into a nightmare of urban warfare where German advantages in mobility and combined arms were neutralized. Soviet defenders, fighting from the rubble of their own city, proved impossible to dislodge, despite months of bloody combat. When Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army, Hitler faced a crucial decision. His generals pleaded for permission to allow the Sixth Army to break out and retreat to defensible positions. Instead, Hitler ordered the doomed forces to stand fast, promising supply by air that never materialized. For 3 months, the Sixth Army slowly starved and froze while Hitler refused all evacuation attempts. In February 1943, over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered, a catastrophe that marked what military historians call the beginning of the end for Germany. The destruction of an entire army at Stalingrad not only eliminated elite German forces, but also shattered the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility. From that point forward, German forces were permanently on the defensive across all fronts. These strategic blunders weren't simply military miscalculations. They flowed directly from something far more dangerous: Hitler's toxic ideology and his increasing megalomania. Hitler viewed World War II not as a conventional conflict, but as an ideological crusade, a racial war against Jews and Slavs, and a fight to the death with communism. This worldview systematically poisoned German strategic thinking at every level. Traditional military objectives like securing territory, controlling resources, or neutralizing enemy forces were consistently subordinated to ideological goals that made no military sense. The result was a war machine that worked against its own interests at every turn. In occupied Eastern Europe, Nazi racial policies transformed what could have been Germany's greatest strategic asset into its most devastating liability. When German forces first crossed into Soviet territory, many local populations, particularly in Ukraine, the Baltics, and Belarus, initially welcomed them as liberators from Stalin's brutal regime. The Soviet system had terrorized these regions through forced collectivization, mass deportations, and systematic purges. Millions had suffered under communist rule, and many were genuinely hopeful that German occupation might bring relief. Some Ukrainian and Baltic units even volunteered to fight alongside German forces against the Red Army. Instead of exploiting this incredible strategic opportunity, Nazi racial ideology demanded that Slavic populations be treated as subhuman. Heinrich Himmler's General Plan Ost called for the systematic extermination or enslavement of tens of millions of Slavs to make room for German settlers. Local populations soon discovered that Nazi occupation was far worse than Soviet oppression. Mass executions, arbitrary deportations for slave labor, and deliberate starvation policies turned potential allies into implacable enemies. Villages that might have provided intelligence, supplies, and recruits instead became centers of partisan resistance. The Wehrmacht found itself fighting not only the Red Army, but also an increasingly sophisticated guerrilla war that tied down hundreds of thousands of troops in rear area security operations. The numbers are staggering. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of German troops were tied down in anti-partisan operations across occupied Europe, forces desperately needed on the front lines. These security divisions, composed largely of older reservists and foreign volunteers, proved increasingly ineffective against partisan units that enjoyed local support and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Similarly, Hitler's obsession with exterminating Jews and other groups diverted massive resources away from the war effort. The Holocaust wasn't just morally catastrophic, it was strategically insane. Train lines desperately needed for military supplies instead carried deportation trains. Industrial facilities that could have produced weapons instead processed murder on an industrial scale. The SS diverted enormous manpower and resources to genocide that could have been used for military purposes. Skilled Jewish workers, engineers, and scientists who might have contributed to German war production were instead systematically murdered. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery of the final solution consumed bureaucratic capacity and logistics that the Wehrmacht desperately needed. This ideological fanaticism also shaped German occupation policies throughout Europe. Rather than creating a European confederation united against Soviet communism, a potentially winning strategy, Nazi racial theories demanded the brutal subjugation of supposedly inferior peoples. France, despite military defeat, retained enough autonomy to eventually contribute to Allied victory through the resistance. Norway, Denmark, and other occupied countries became sources of intelligence and sabotage rather than willing collaborators. As the war progressed, Hitler's early diplomatic successes in the late 1930s had fed a dangerous overconfidence that convinced him of his own military genius. These victories, achieved through bluff and intimidation rather than military prowess, created a fatal delusion that Hitler's intuition was superior to professional military expertise. Hitler increasingly dismissed his generals' expertise, famously declaring that his generals knew nothing and systematically marginalizing the very professionals who had created the Wehrmacht's early tactical successes. The German officer corps, products of the world's most sophisticated military education system, found their expertise increasingly dismissed in favor of Hitler's ideological certainties and intuitive hunches. By late 1941, Frustrated with military setbacks and convinced that his commanders lacked sufficient National Socialist fervor, Hitler literally took direct command of the Wehrmacht. After dismissing General Walter von Brauchitsch, he assumed the role of commander-in-chief of the army, making himself directly responsible for tactical decisions on multiple fronts simultaneously. The consequences proved catastrophic for German military effectiveness. Hitler began micromanaging battlefield decisions from his various headquarters, often hundreds of miles from the front lines, and with little understanding of local tactical realities. His infamous no-retreat orders transformed rational tactical withdrawals into needless disasters that destroyed entire German formations. This pattern repeated across multiple theaters with devastating consistency. At Stalingrad, experienced commanders pleaded for permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal to defensible positions. Instead, Hitler's rigid insistence on holding every inch of ground led to the encirclement and destruction of the entire Sixth Army. Over 200,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a battle that served no strategic purpose beyond Hitler's prestige. In North Africa, similar inflexibility prevented Rommel from conducting the mobile defense that might have preserved the Afrika Korps. When the British Eighth Army launched its offensive at El Alamein, German forces were forced to fight from fixed positions that negated their advantages in maneuver warfare. The result was another devastating defeat that could have been avoided through tactical flexibility. The Normandy campaign provided perhaps the most glaring example of Hitler's tactical incompetence. When Allied forces landed on D-Day, German commanders on the scene immediately recognized the landing's significance and requested permission to deploy panzer reserves. Hitler, sleeping late and refusing to be awakened, delayed crucial decisions for hours. Even worse, his preconceptions about Allied strategy, reinforced by successful deception operations, led him to believe the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. For weeks after D-Day, he insisted on holding back the strongest German divisions, convinced the real invasion would still come at Pas-de-Calais. By the time he acknowledged his error, Allied forces had established an unshakable foothold in France. This micromanagement extended beyond tactical decisions to strategic planning. Hitler's interference in research and development led to numerous technological disasters. His insistence that the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter be configured as a bomber rather than an interceptor delayed its deployment in air defense until Allied bombing had already crippled German industry. Over time, Hitler eventually fell out with most of his high command. All 4 of his army chiefs of staff were dismissed, and roughly 2/3 of his field marshals and many senior generals were removed. This purge eliminated much of the Wehrmacht's institutional knowledge and battlefield expertise. Veterans of the Eastern Front, who understood the realities of modern warfare, were replaced by Nazi Party loyalists who prioritized ideological purity over military competence. The result was an increasingly dysfunctional command structure that couldn't adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Perhaps most destructively, Hitler's ideological fanaticism bred fatal miscalculations about Germany's strategic situation. So committed to the idea of Nazi supremacy, he consistently downplayed material realities that any rational assessment would have recognized as insurmountable. When confronted with evidence of Allied industrial superiority, Hitler dismissed concerns with rhetoric about German willpower overcoming material disadvantages. He genuinely believed that National Socialist ideology provided a spiritual strength that could compensate for numerical and industrial inferiority. A delusion that proved tragically false when tested against Allied firepower. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler doubled down on an increasingly nihilistic all-or-nothing approach. He declared victory or destruction as the only acceptable outcomes, rejecting any consideration of tactical retreats, limited objectives, or negotiated settlements that might have preserved German lives and territory. This mentality reached its logical conclusion in the war's final phase with Hitler's Nero Decree, orders directing the systematic destruction of Germany's own infrastructure as Allied forces advanced. Roads, bridges, factories, and power plants were to be demolished to prevent their capture, ensuring needless civilian suffering without any military benefit whatsoever. Meanwhile, his ideological hatred of defeatism created an atmosphere where honest military assessments were not just unwelcome, but actively dangerous. Officers who dared warn of impending disasters faced dismissal, court-martial, or worse. This systematically eliminated the feedback mechanisms that might have allowed for course corrections. The result was a leadership structure that had lost all connection to battlefield realities, making decisions based on ideology rather than evidence. As Allied forces closed in from all directions, Hitler continued issuing impossible orders from his bunker, demanding counteroffensives with non-existent divisions and expecting miracle weapons to reverse the tide of war. Beyond strategy and ideology lay an even more fundamental problem. World War II was ultimately a contest of industrial might, and here Hitler faced insurmountable disadvantages from the very beginning. Despite Germany's impressive initial victories, the Nazi economy was structurally unprepared for the prolonged total war that Hitler's limitless ambitions had unleashed. Germany's economic vulnerabilities were evident even before the war began. The Reich lacked access to critical raw materials that modern warfare demanded in enormous quantities. Oil, the lifeblood of mechanized armies, had to be imported or produced through expensive synthetic processes. Rubber for vehicle tires came from distant colonies now controlled by enemies. High-grade iron ore for quality steel was largely imported from Sweden, a supply line vulnerable to Allied naval power. Meanwhile, an increasingly effective Allied blockade strangled German imports. British naval supremacy, reinforced by American vessels after December 1941, created an economic noose around the Reich. Unlike World War I, when unrestricted submarine warfare might have broken British resistance, the Allies now possessed radar, sonar, and escort carriers that systematically defeated the U-boat threat. Once Hitler expanded the conflict to multiple fronts through his declaration of war on the United States, the resource imbalance became absolutely overwhelming. By late 1941, Germany confronted not only British and Soviet production, but also the industrial arsenal of the United States, whose gross domestic product exceeded that of all Axis powers combined by a factor of nearly 2-to-1. The numbers tell a story of inevitable defeat. American factories, protected by two oceans and supercharged by mass production techniques pioneered in Detroit's automobile plants, began generating weapons and equipment on a scale that defied imagination. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 114,000 new aircraft compared to Germany's 40,000, nearly a 3-to-1 advantage in a single year. Even more dramatically, American shipyards launched over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war, replacing merchant vessel losses faster than German U-boats could sink them. Henry Kaiser's revolutionary shipbuilding techniques reduced construction time from months to weeks, with some Liberty ships completed in just 4 days. This industrial miracle ensured that Allied supply lines remained open despite massive German submarine campaigns. Tank production revealed similar disparities. By 1943, the Soviet Union alone was producing over 24,000 tanks annually, while the United States added another 29,000. German tank production peaked at just 19,000 vehicles in 1944, impressive by historical standards, but hopelessly inadequate against combined Allied output exceeding 50,000 tanks per year. Even with Albert Speer's impressive late-war industrial reforms that temporarily boosted German output through rationalization and slave labor, it was never enough. Speer's measures, implemented after becoming armaments minister in 1942, did achieve remarkable increases in production efficiency. German aircraft production tripled between 1942 and 1944, while ammunition output increased by 300%. However, these gains came too late and from too small a base. By 1943, the Allies were manufacturing 5 to 6 times more airplanes annually than Germany, with similarly dominant advantages in virtually every category of military equipment. The Allies also enjoyed vast manpower superiority that Germany's aging population couldn't match. At the war's height, 26 million Allied soldiers were in uniform versus 17 million Axis troops, a gap that widened steadily as the conflict progressed. This economic warfare became even more devastating when we considered Germany's critical resource shortages. Oil became the Reich's Achilles heel. The country's mechanized military consumed petroleum at rates that domestic production and synthetic fuel plants couldn't sustain. Before the war, Germany imported 85% of its oil, primarily from the Soviet Union and Romania. Operation Barbarossa eliminated Soviet supplies overnight, while Romania's oil fields, though vital to German operations, produced only a fraction of Wehrmacht requirements. Synthetic fuel production, concentrated in massive plants like the Leuna Works, required enormous investments of capital in coal while yielding relatively modest quantities of gasoline. Hitler's 1942 drive toward the Caucasus oil fields represented a desperate attempt to secure sufficient fuel for continued operations. The failure of this offensive left German forces literally running on fumes by 1944. Luftwaffe pilots found their training reduced to minimal levels due to fuel shortages, creating a vicious cycle where inexperienced pilots were shot down at increasing rates by better-trained Allied aviators. By the war's final year, German panzer divisions were reduced to tactical immobility due to fuel shortages. The once feared Wehrmacht, built around rapid mechanized advances, found itself increasingly dependent on horse-drawn transport that belonged to an earlier era of warfare. Meanwhile, the Allies leveraged their economic superiority through devastating strategic bombing campaigns that systematically dismantled German war production. From 1943 onward, massive Allied bomber fleets hammered German industrial cities around the clock in an unprecedented campaign of economic warfare. The numbers were staggering. By 1944, the Allies were dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs annually on German targets, more than the entire weight of the German bomber force that had attacked Britain during the Blitz. These raids employed sophisticated tactics that maximized industrial damage while minimizing Allied losses. Key industrial regions bore the brunt of this assault. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, was pounded relentlessly by British night raids and American daylight attacks. The famous Dam Busters raid of May 1943 demonstrated Allied technological innovation, using revolutionary bouncing bombs to breach the Möhne and Eder dams, temporarily flooding crucial industrial areas and disrupting transportation networks. Cities like Hamburg experienced apocalyptic destruction that shocked even hardened German officials. The July 1943 firestorm killed an estimated 37,000 to 43,000 civilians and devastated industrial districts, shocking the German public. These attacks demonstrated that Allied air power could now inflict damage on a scale that German defensive measures couldn't counter. More systematically destructive were sustained campaigns against specific industrial targets. Allied bombing of ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt seriously disrupted ball-bearing output and forced costly dispersal, straining aircraft production, while raids on synthetic fuel plants reduced German petroleum output by 80% in 1944. Transportation networks became priority targets, with systematic attacks on rail yards, bridges, and marshalling centers that paralyzed German logistics. By 1944, Allied air supremacy meant that German factories, transportation networks, and fuel depots could be destroyed almost at will. German industrial workers, instead of producing weapons for the front, spent increasing amounts of time in air raid shelters or repairing bomb damage. This bombing campaign not only reduced Nazi war production, but also shattered civilian morale and demonstrated the Reich's inability to protect its own territory. Crucially, this industrial warfare was entirely one-sided. While German cities burned, American and Soviet factories operated at full capacity, safely protected from retaliation. British production not only continued despite the earlier Blitz, but actually increased throughout the war as factories were dispersed and production methods improved. The Soviet Union's industrial mobilization proved particularly impressive. Despite losing enormous territory in 1941, including major industrial centers like Leningrad and Stalingrad, Soviet production actually increased through heroic efforts to relocate entire factories beyond the Ural Mountains. By 1943, Soviet war production exceeded pre-war levels despite operating under wartime conditions that would have crippled less determined societies. American industrial conversion was even more remarkable. Companies like General Motors and Ford, which had never manufactured military equipment, retooled their assembly lines to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and ammunition on automotive production scales. Detroit Arsenal produced approximately 22,000 Shermans, more than any single German plant, and was a cornerstone of U.S. mass production. This industrial mobilization extended beyond weapons to the entire logistical infrastructure of modern war. American factories produced not just tanks and planes, but also the trucks, radios, medical supplies, uniforms, and countless other items that kept Allied armies operational. Through Lend-Lease, American production equipped not only U.S. forces but also supplied Britain and the Soviet Union with crucial materials they couldn't produce themselves. Even Germany's desperate use of slave labor couldn't compensate for these fundamental disadvantages. By 1944, over 7 million foreign workers labored in German factories under brutal conditions. Yet this massive exploitation actually reduced overall productivity. Sabotage, poor motivation, and the administrative burden of managing forced labor meant that German factories operated far below their theoretical capacity. Oppressive occupation policies meant conquered territories contributed far less than Berlin expected, and at high security cost. Adding to Germany's economic woes was a technological arms race that Germany was steadily losing. Contrary to persistent myths about German technological superiority, the Allies systematically gained crucial advantages in the technologies that actually determined the war's outcome. While Germany developed some impressive weapon systems, Allied scientists and engineers consistently innovated faster and deployed new technologies more effectively in the areas that truly mattered for military success. Radar technology provides perhaps the most decisive example of Allied technological superiority. By 1940, Britain had established the world's first comprehensive radar defense network, the Chain-Home system, consisting of towering steel masts that provided early warning of incoming Luftwaffe raids across the entire English coastline. This revolutionary technology proved absolutely critical in winning the Battle of Britain. The radar stations allowed RAF Fighter Command to detect German formations while they were still assembling over France, providing precious minutes to scramble interceptors and position them advantageously. Without radar, British fighters would have been forced to maintain standing patrols that would have exhausted pilots and aircraft within weeks. Instead, RAF squadrons could remain on the ground until German formations were actually approaching, conserving fuel and pilot fatigue for the crucial moments of combat. German aircraft, by contrast, flew without equivalent detection capabilities, often arriving over British targets to find RAF fighters already waiting in ambush. The Luftwaffe's numerical superiority was systematically negated by Britain's technological edge, which multiplied the effectiveness of smaller British forces through superior tactical intelligence. This technological advantage extended far beyond Britain's shores. In the Battle of the Atlantic, Allied radar innovations systematically destroyed Germany's submarine threat. Early radar systems were limited by their long wavelengths, which U-boats could detect and avoid. However, Allied scientists developed microwave radar with much shorter wavelengths that submarines couldn't detect, making them vulnerable to surprise attacks. Small escort carriers equipped with radar-guided aircraft began accompanying merchant convoys, transforming the tactical situation overnight. U-boats that had previously operated with impunity on the surface found themselves under constant aerial surveillance. By 1943, German submarines were being destroyed faster than shipyards could replace them, forcing Admiral Dönitz to concede defeat in the Atlantic campaign that had been Germany's most effective weapon against British supply lines. Perhaps even more significant was Allied superiority in cryptographic and computing technology. The successful breaking of Germany's Enigma cipher represented not just an intelligence coup, but a technological achievement that gave the Allies an almost supernatural ability to anticipate German moves. The British code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park wasn't merely a matter of mathematical brilliance. It required the development of revolutionary computing machines that were decades ahead of their time. The Colossus computers, used to break German diplomatic and high command communications, were among the world's first programmable electronic computers, capable of processing information at speeds that would have been impossible through manual methods. This technological edge provided the Allies with what amounted to a systematic window into German strategic thinking. Ultra-intelligence allowed Allied commanders to read German battle plans, supply situations, and troop movements as if they had access to Wehrmacht headquarters. The technological superiority that made this possible shortened the war by an estimated 2 years and saved countless Allied lives. Meanwhile, German cryptographic technology, despite the sophistication of the Enigma system, proved systematically vulnerable to Allied code-breaking efforts. German confidence in their encryption systems led to careless communication practices that provided Allied intelligence with enormous advantages across every theater of operations. Germany also suffered from significant technological gaps in crucial military capabilities. Most notably, Hitler never developed a strategic heavy bomber force comparable to Allied capabilities, a decision that proved catastrophic for Germany's ability to project power beyond the European continent. While the Allies fielded massive fleets of four-engine bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, Avro Lancasters, and others, capable of delivering thousands of tons of explosives to targets throughout occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe relied primarily on medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and Dornier Du 217 with limited range and payload capacity. This technological gap meant Germany had no effective way to disrupt American war production, which operated safely beyond the reach of German bombers. While Allied strategic bombing systematically dismantled German industry, American factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and other industrial centers operated at full capacity throughout the war, completely immune from retaliation. The absence of German heavy bombers also meant the Luftwaffe couldn't effectively support ground operations at extended distances. When German forces advanced deep into the Soviet Union, they moved beyond the range of their own air support, while Soviet factories relocated beyond the Ural Mountains remained completely safe from German air attack. Additionally, Germany remained surprisingly dependent on pre-industrial transportation methods throughout the conflict. While the Wehrmacht's Panzer spearheads projected an image of mechanized modernity, the German army actually relied heavily on horse-drawn transport for supply operations. Over 750,000 horses served with the Wehrmacht at any given time, and millions were requisitioned over the course of the war, a stark contrast to Allied motorization. This technological backwardness in logistics created severe supply problems that worsened as German forces advanced deeper into enemy territory. Soviet and American forces, by contrast, enjoyed fully mechanized supply lines supported by vast numbers of trucks, locomotives, and aircraft that could maintain operations at extended distances. Ironically, Hitler's fixation on revolutionary wonder weapons became a significant technological disadvantage rather than the war-winning advantage he imagined. The Nazis invested enormous resources in Wunderwaffe projects, V-1 buzz bombs, V-2 ballistic missiles, jet fighters, rocket-powered interceptors, and impractically heavy tanks, hoping for game-changing technological breakthroughs that would reverse Germany's deteriorating strategic position. While some of these represented impressive engineering achievements that were decades ahead of their time, they typically arrived too late, in too few numbers, and with too many technical problems to affect the war's outcome. Even worse, they diverted precious resources from mass-producing proven weapons that might have made a genuine difference in Germany's defensive capabilities. The V-2 rocket program exemplifies this misguided technological emphasis. When first deployed in late 1944, the V-2 was indeed a revolutionary weapon, the world's first operational ballistic missile, capable of supersonic flight and immune to interception by existing air defenses. The technological achievement was undeniable, representing advances in rocketry, guidance systems, and propulsion that wouldn't be matched by other nations for years. However, as the Imperial War Museum notes, the V-2 was expensive, resource-intensive, and had little strategic value, perfectly illustrating Germany's futile obsession with spectacular technology over practical military effectiveness. Each V-2 required approximately 13 tons of rare materials and 4,000 man-hours to manufacture, while carrying only a 1-ton warhead, less explosive power than a single sortie by a conventional bomber. The entire V-weapon program consumed resources that could have produced thousands of conventional fighter aircraft desperately needed to defend German skies against Allied bombing campaigns. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was critically short of both aircraft and trained pilots. Yet limited production capacity was diverted to missiles that had minimal impact on the war's outcome. Similarly, Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, though technologically revolutionary, was badly mismanaged through Hitler's personal interference. Hitler's push to use the Me-262 as a fighter bomber delayed its interceptor deployment until late 1944, by which time fuel and trained pilots were scarce. Even when Me-262s finally entered combat as fighters, their technological advantages were negated by overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and superior pilot training. A few dozen advanced fighters couldn't counter the thousands of Allied aircraft that darkened German skies by 1945. In contrast, Allied technological efforts concentrated on practical military advantages that could be mass-produced and deployed effectively under battlefield conditions. The Soviet T-34 tank, while not the most sophisticated design, proved superior to early German panzers through an optimal combination of armor, firepower, mobility, and, crucially, manufacturing simplicity that allowed mass production. The American proximity fuse, developed in secret collaboration with British scientists, revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare by dramatically improving the effectiveness of defensive fire against German aircraft and V-1 missiles. Unlike German wonder weapons, the proximity fuse was immediately useful, could be mass-produced, and provided measurable tactical advantages. British technological innovations like improved radar systems, jet engine research, and advanced cryptographic machines were systematically shared with American allies, creating a multiplier effect that accelerated Allied technological development. This cooperation contrasted sharply with German technological efforts, which were often duplicated by competing agencies and hampered by secrecy that prevented effective coordination. Most significantly, the Manhattan Project demonstrated the Allies' overwhelming scientific industrial superiority through the successful development of atomic weapons. While Germany had theoretical knowledge of nuclear fission, the project's scale, employing over 130,000 workers and consuming more electrical power than many entire countries, was simply beyond German capabilities given the Reich's resource constraints and industrial limitations. Even if Germany had solved its economic and technological problems, it still faced an insurmountable challenge. The Allies possessed a crucial strategic asset that Germany fundamentally lacked. Beyond material advantages, the British, Americans, and Soviets had achieved genuine cooperation and coordination among partners who shared common goals and complementary capabilities. While the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, essentially fought separate wars with minimal coordination and often conflicting objectives, the Allied coalition gradually forged a unity that became far more powerful than the sum of its individual parts. This unity required overcoming profound ideological differences that might have seemed insurmountable. Capitalist democracies and the Communist Soviet Union set aside their fundamental disagreements about economic systems, political freedom, and social organization to focus on their common enemy. The achievement was remarkable. Churchill's Britain, Roosevelt's America, and Stalin's Soviet Union, representing radically different political systems and worldviews, managed to coordinate their strategies, share resources, and maintain alliance discipline throughout 4 years of global warfare. Allied leaders met regularly in high-level conferences that produced genuine strategic coordination rather than mere diplomatic pleasantries. The Casablanca Conference of January 1943 established the crucial principle of unconditional surrender and coordinated the invasion of Italy. The Tehran Conference of November 1943 saw Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agree on the timing and objectives of the cross-channel invasion of France. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 planned the final assault on Germany and the post-war occupation. These conferences weren't just photo opportunities. They produced binding agreements that shaped military operations across the globe. By 1944, this coordination enabled sophisticated multi-front operations that systematically overwhelmed Germany's ability to respond effectively. The Western Allies opened their long-promised Second Front in Normandy, precisely as Stalin had urged, drawing German forces away from the Eastern Front and relieving pressure on the Red Army at the moment when Soviet forces were preparing their own massive offensive operations. This two-front coordination created an impossible strategic dilemma for German commanders. Hitler's overstretched forces couldn't be strong everywhere simultaneously. Reinforcing France meant weakening the Eastern Front, while concentrating against Soviet offensives left Western Europe vulnerable to Allied amphibious assault. The multifront war thus systematically diluted German strength and prevented the Wehrmacht from achieving decisive local superiority anywhere. Hitler, meanwhile, struggled with fractious and unreliable allies who often hindered rather than helped German war efforts. Italy under Mussolini proved more liability than asset, requiring German troops to prop up failing Italian operations in Greece, North Africa, and the Balkans. German commanders sardonically observed that fighting with the Italians was harder than fighting against them, as Italian military incompetence repeatedly compromised German strategic plans. When Italy effectively collapsed following Mussolini's overthrow in July 1943, Germany was forced to divert precious troops from other fronts to occupy the Italian peninsula and fight Allied forces advancing from the south. This Italian campaign tied down numerous German divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were mounting increasingly powerful offensives. Japan provided even less meaningful assistance to German war efforts. Despite the formal Axis alliance, Japanese strategy in the Pacific was entirely disconnected from German objectives in Europe. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into the war but provided no corresponding benefit to Germany's campaigns against Britain or the Soviet Union. In fact, Japanese neutrality toward the Soviet Union allowed Stalin to transfer experienced Siberian divisions to the defense of Moscow at the crucial moment in December 1941. The contrast between Allied unity and Axis fragmentation was stark and decisive. While German forces fought essentially alone against the combined might of three major powers, Allied forces enjoyed mutual support that multiplied their individual capabilities exponentially. This coordination extended far beyond military strategy to encompass intelligence sharing, technological cooperation, and resource distribution on an unprecedented scale. This systematic collaboration created synergistic effects that amplified the already substantial material advantages that individual Allied nations possessed. British technological advances, including radar systems, jet engine research, cryptographic techniques, and naval innovations, were systematically shared with American manufacturers and engineers. This technology transfer allowed American industrial capacity to produce British-designed equipment on a massive scale, while American manufacturing expertise improved British designs for mass production. Similarly, Soviet tactical innovations and battlefield experience were shared with Western allies through military missions and intelligence exchanges. Soviet anti-tank tactics, developed through bitter experience on the Eastern Front, informed American and British armored doctrine. Western strategic bombing techniques and navigational aids were adapted for Soviet use against German industrial targets. Most significantly, American Lend-Lease aid created a global supply network that equipped not only American forces, but also provided crucial materials to both Britain and the Soviet Union. This wasn't merely a matter of surplus American equipment. It represented a carefully coordinated system that allocated resources according to strategic priorities across all Allied fronts. The numbers reveal the staggering scale of this cooperation. American Lend-Lease provided the Soviet Union with 400,000 trucks and jeeps, 7,000 tanks, 14,000 aircraft, and enormous quantities of fuel, food, and raw materials. British forces received American Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, and vast quantities of ammunition and supplies. Meanwhile, British technical expertise and global intelligence networks provided Americans with crucial information about German capabilities and intentions. This resource sharing meant that Soviet forces could concentrate their industrial production on tanks and artillery, while relying on American vehicles for mobility and logistics. British forces could focus on naval and air operations, while American industrial capacity provided the ships and aircraft needed for global operations. American forces could deploy worldwide, while British bases and intelligence networks provided the infrastructure for global operations. By 1944, Allied coordination had evolved into a sophisticated system that enabled devastating multi-front pressure that German forces simply couldn't counter effectively. The timing of major Allied operations was carefully coordinated to prevent Germany from shifting reserves between threatened sectors. While Soviet and German forces clashed at Kursk in July 1943 in the largest tank battle in history, Western allies simultaneously launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This forced Germany to divide attention and resources between Eastern and Mediterranean fronts, preventing the Wehrmacht from concentrating its full strength against either Soviet or Anglo-American forces. The coordination became even more sophisticated as Allied capabilities expanded. The D-Day landings of June 6, 1944, were timed to coincide with renewed Soviet offensive operations that prevented German reinforcement of Western Europe. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, began just weeks after the Normandy landings and systematically destroyed German Army Group Center, while Western Allied forces were still establishing their beachhead in France. This coordination extended to the tactical level through shared intelligence and communication systems. Allied commanders could coordinate air support, naval operations, and ground movements across vast distances through secure communication networks that German forces couldn't intercept or disrupt. Moreover, Allied control of global sea lanes by 1943 ensured the continuous flow of troops, equipment, and supplies between Allied nations while Germany remained increasingly isolated. British and American naval supremacy meant that resources could be shifted between theaters according to strategic priorities, while German forces in occupied territories became increasingly cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The Western Allies' air superiority, achieved through coordinated production and training programs, meant that by 1944, German movements were paralyzed by constant air attack throughout occupied Europe. Allied aircraft could operate freely over German territory, while German aviation was reduced to desperate defensive operations using inexperienced pilots and inadequate fuel supplies. As historian Richard Evans notes, by 1943-44, Germany was outmatched on manpower, production, logistics, sea and air power. The Reich faced enemies who enjoyed superior industrial capacity, technological innovation, and strategic coordination, advantages that compounded over time as the war progressed, and German capabilities diminished through attrition and resource depletion. Lurking behind all these visible advantages was perhaps the most decisive factor of all, an intelligence war that the Allies had won so completely that German leaders never even realized they were fighting it. The Allies achieved their most spectacular hidden victory through systematic technological and intellectual superiority that gave Allied commanders an almost supernatural ability to anticipate German moves throughout the entire war. At the heart of this triumph was the cracking of Germany's supposedly unbreakable Enigma cipher machine, an achievement that represented one of the greatest intellectual accomplishments in human history. The Enigma machine represented the pinnacle of 1930s cryptographic technology, with over 150 trillion possible settings. German cryptographers believed their communications were absolutely secure from enemy code-breaking efforts. The machine's complexity seemed to guarantee that even if enemies captured Enigma devices, they couldn't possibly decrypt German messages without knowing the specific daily settings used by German operators. However, British and Polish mathematicians working at Bletchley Park proved these assumptions catastrophically wrong. Through a combination of brilliant mathematical analysis, captured equipment, and revolutionary computing technology, Allied codebreakers managed to read vast numbers of German communications throughout the war. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, provided Allied commanders with an invaluable window into Hitler's strategic planning and tactical deployments. The technological achievement was as significant as the intelligence value. Breaking Enigma required the development of revolutionary electromechanical computers called bombs that could test thousands of possible Enigma settings in hours, rather than the years that manual analysis would have required. The more sophisticated Colossus computers used to break German diplomatic and high command communications represented some of the world's first programmable electronic computers, decades ahead of their time. This technological edge provided the Allies with systematic access to German strategic thinking at the highest levels. Ultra intercepts revealed not just tactical information about troop movements and supply situations, but also strategic intelligence about German war production, research priorities, and even Hitler's personal orders to field commanders. In the Battle of the Atlantic, this intelligence advantage proved absolutely decisive. Allied codebreakers routinely read U-boat radio communications, including patrol assignments, attack instructions, and position reports. Starting in 1941 and accelerating through 1943, this allowed convoy commanders to reroute merchant ships away from submarine patrol lines while directing anti-submarine forces to ambush German U-boats at their most vulnerable moments. The impact was devastating for German naval operations. By 1943, German submarines were being destroyed faster than shipyards could replace them, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his forces from the North Atlantic in what he later called Black May. Dönitz himself admitted after the war that Allied intelligence capabilities were a decisive factor in Germany's defeat in the Atlantic campaign that had been the Reich's most effective weapon against British supply lines. Beyond code-breaking, the Allies excelled at sophisticated deception operations that systematically fed Hitler false information at crucial moments throughout the war. These operations weren't simply matters of spreading rumors or planting false documents. They represented complex, coordinated campaigns that used Germany's own intelligence systems against them. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception surrounding D-Day, represents perhaps the greatest intelligence achievement of the war. The Allies created an entirely fictional 1st U.S. Army Group under General Patton, complete with dummy inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, fabricated supply depots, and even non-existent airfields complete with plywood aircraft. German reconnaissance flights over southeastern England photographed what appeared to be massive military preparations for an assault on Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Meanwhile, German spies in Britain, virtually all of whom had been captured and turned into double agents by British intelligence, fed the Wehrmacht detailed reports of Allied preparations for the fictitious Calais invasion. The deception was so comprehensive and convincing that when D-Day actually began at Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler and the German High Command initially dismissed the landings as a diversionary attack. Fearing that the real invasion would still come at Calais, they held back their strongest panzer reserves for weeks after the Normandy landings, allowing Allied forces crucial time to establish and expand their beachheads. The German 15th Army remained around Pas-de-Calais for weeks, delaying major reinforcements to Normandy. This delay in German reinforcement proved absolutely critical to the success of Operation Overlord. By the time German leadership realized that Normandy was indeed the main Allied effort, it was too late to dislodge the Allied foothold in Western Europe. The deception had effectively neutralized Germany's best opportunity to defeat the invasion at the water's edge. Such intelligence operations were repeated across multiple theaters with consistent success. Operation Mincemeat in 1943 used a corpse carrying fake invasion plans to convince German commanders that Allied forces would attack Greece rather than Sicily, causing the redeployment of German reserves away from the actual invasion target. In the Pacific Theater, Allied intelligence operations convinced Japanese commanders that the main American effort would come in the Central Pacific rather than the Philippines, contributing to Japanese strategic errors that accelerated their defeat. Meanwhile, German intelligence services struggled with internal rivalries, bureaucratic dysfunction, and Hitler's own paranoid mistrust of professional intelligence officers. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was eventually absorbed by Heinrich Himmler's SS after repeatedly failing to provide accurate intelligence about Allied intentions and capabilities. German intelligence suffered from fundamental structural problems that no amount of individual talent could overcome. Competing agencies, the Abwehr, SS intelligence services, foreign ministry intelligence, and party intelligence organizations often worked at cross purposes, duplicating efforts while jealously guarding information from potential rivals. Hitler's own paranoia created additional obstacles to effective intelligence gathering and analysis. He frequently dismissed intelligence reports that contradicted his preconceptions, while promoting officers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what evidence actually indicated. This created a systematic bias toward optimistic assessments that consistently underestimated Allied capabilities and intentions. Most significantly, German codebreakers never achieved anything comparable to Ultra, despite possessing some of the world's most sophisticated mathematical and engineering talent. German cryptographic efforts were hampered by insufficient resources, organizational conflicts, and the fundamental assumption that their own communications were secure. Allied communications remained largely secure throughout the war through various innovative methods. The famous Navajo code talkers in the Pacific Theater used their native language as an unbreakable code that Japanese cryptographers couldn't even identify, let alone decrypt. Soviet forces used sophisticated one-time cipher pads that were mathematically unbreakable when properly implemented. British and American diplomatic communications used advanced encryption systems that German codebreakers never successfully penetrated. This comprehensive intelligence superiority provided the Allies with what amounted to a massive hidden advantage throughout the entire conflict. Allied commanders knew German troop dispositions, supply situations, strategic intentions, and even tactical plans, while operating with reasonable confidence that their own communications remained secure from German interception. The psychological impact on German operations was severe, though largely unrecognized at the time. German commanders found that their surprise attacks were anticipated, their secret troop movements were countered before they could achieve their objectives, and their supply convoys were ambushed with uncanny precision. This created a growing sense among German officers that Allied intelligence capabilities bordered on the supernatural. Countless Allied lives were saved through advance warning of German attacks, while numerous Allied operations succeeded because commanders knew exactly where German forces were positioned and what they were planning. The intelligence advantage allowed Allied forces to achieve tactical surprise even when they were attacking well-prepared defensive positions. Ultra-intelligence was so valuable that Allied commanders sometimes accepted tactical disadvantages rather than risk revealing their code-breaking capabilities to German intelligence. Convoys were occasionally allowed to sail into known U-boat patrol areas to maintain the fiction that routing decisions were based on normal intelligence rather than decrypted German communications. Historians widely agree Ultra significantly shortened the war, often estimated up to 2 years, though the exact figure is debated. What's certain is that this systematic intelligence advantage provided the Allies with a formidable edge that German forces never suspected existed and never managed to counter effectively throughout the entire war. Hitler lost World War II because he set in motion a perfect storm of forces that Germany could never withstand. His reckless strategic overextension, fighting simultaneous wars against enemies with vastly superior resources, was compounded by ideological fanaticism that consistently clouded his judgment and transformed potential allies into implacable enemies. Germany's defeat was sealed by the very characteristics that defined Hitler's rule: aggression that provoked a superior coalition, hubris that led to fatal miscalculations, and brutality that united the world against the Nazi regime. Key turning points like Stalingrad, El Alamein, Kursk, and D-Day weren't isolated events but inevitable results of these underlying factors converging into an unstoppable force. But how did this Austrian corporal with no political experience manage to seize control of Europe's most advanced nation and launch the deadliest conflict in human history? The shocking story of Hitler's rise from failed artist to absolute dictator reveals lessons about democracy's vulnerability that remain terrifyingly relevant today.